In the spring of 1933, millions of Americans walked into banks carrying the most valuable thing they owned, gold, and walked out with paper they didn't trust. They weren't robbed by gangsters. They weren't tricked by con men. They were following the law. But what they didn't know was that in less than a year, the same gold they surrendered would make the US government billions, while leaving ordinary families with nothing. It all started with one man's pen stroke, a decision that remains one of the most profitable and most controversial government moves in American history. Mary Thompson's fingers tightened around a small cloth bag. Inside were her father's gold coins, dull with age but heavy with meaning. He'd earned them during the California Gold Rush, a story he'd told her 100 times by the fireplace. To Mary, they weren't just money. They were her family's lifeline, their security, their history. It was April 30th, 1933. She stood in a long, silent line inside a bank in San Francisco, shuffling forward one step at a time. A month earlier, she would have been depositing them as savings, but now she was handing them over because the law demanded it. 25 days earlier, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had signed Executive Order 6002, a decree that made it illegal to own most forms of gold in America. Anyone caught keeping it risked a $10,000 fine or 10 years in federal prison. And the exchange rate wasn't negotiable. $20.67 per ounce. Take it or leave it. Mary didn't want paper bills. She didn't trust them. But there was no choice. She slid the coins across the counter, the teller counted them without looking her in the eye, and she walked out with cash she knew would never hold the same weight, literally or figuratively. Less than a year later, that same gold would be worth $35 an ounce, but only in the government's hands. The difference would amount to billions in profit for Washington. Mary's story was not unique. Across the country, over 3,600 tons of privately held gold were surrendered. In towns from New York to Nebraska, families gave up heirlooms, coins, and bullion that had survived wars and recessions, all in the name of saving the economy. But what most Americans didn't realize at the time was this: their sacrifice wasn't just about stabilizing the dollar. It was about enabling one of the most dramatic and profitable financial maneuvers in history. And to understand how it happened, you first need to know the rule that tied every single American dollar to a very specific promise. A promise the government was about to break. Before 1933, your dollar wasn't just ink on paper. It was a promise. A promise that somewhere, locked inside a government vault, sat a chunk of gold with your name on it. Since 1879, the United States had operated under the gold standard. That meant every single paper dollar could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold, on demand. If you didn't trust the bank, you could walk in with your bills and walk out with real physical metal. Americans believed in their currency because it wasn't just money. It was a claim check for something tangible, something timeless. Many families kept gold coins or gold certificates tucked away for safekeeping, not as an investment but as the ultimate security. This system had worked for decades. The gold standard was seen as a safeguard against reckless government spending. After all, the government couldn't print more money than they had gold to back it up. But in October 1929, the stock market crashed, and the gold standard's biggest strength became its greatest weakness. As the Great Depression spread, banks began to collapse one after another. Families watched their life savings evaporate. Word spread that more banks were failing, and panic set in. But Americans didn't just want to withdraw their paper money, they wanted the gold it represented. And once people started converting paper to gold, they didn't stop. The logic was simple. If the banks go under, your paper bills become worthless. But gold? Gold holds value no matter what. Lines began forming outside banks across the country. Inside, vault doors swung open and gold flowed out faster than anyone thought possible. Every withdrawal depleted the Federal Reserve's reserves, and each ounce gone was one step closer to the entire system collapsing. By early 1933, the numbers were terrifying. If Americans kept demanding gold at the same pace, the U.S. would run out within months. The gold standard, the very backbone of the dollar, would shatter. Franklin D. Roosevelt, newly inaugurated, faced an impossible choice. He could try traditional economic fixes like lowering interest rates or expanding government spending, but those were slow solutions. The gold was leaving now. Every day without action meant more reserves gone, more trust lost, and a higher chance of total collapse. But there was a bigger problem. Even if the government stopped banks from handing out gold, millions of ounces were still sitting in people's homes, in desk drawers, coffee tins, and safe deposit boxes. As long as citizens could hold on to it, the government couldn't truly control the value of the dollar. Roosevelt came to one inescapable conclusion. If the U.S. was going to survive, it had to sever the link between gold and the dollar entirely. And that meant one thing: gold had to be removed from private hands. The question was how. What Roosevelt decided next would turn millions of ordinary Americans into criminals overnight. Imagine waking up to find that something you owned yesterday, legally, proudly, maybe even for generations, could now put you behind bars for a decade. That's what happened on April 5, 1933. The voice on the radio was calm, almost casual as it read the president's words. But the message was anything but ordinary.
Private ownership of gold is now a federal crime.
Franklin D. Roosevelt had just signed Executive Order 6102, forbidding the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States. On paper, it sounded like a technical banking rule. In reality, it was the largest forced transfer of private wealth in American history. You had 25 days. 25 days to hand over your gold to a bank or the U.S. Mint. Whether you were a Wall Street banker with gold bars in a vault or a farmer with a few coins hidden in a jar, the rule was the same: surrender it or become a criminal. The penalties were brutal: a $10,000 fine, 10 years in federal prison, or both. For perspective, $10,000 in 1933 was 6 years of an average worker's wages. Yes, there were exceptions. Your wedding ring was safe, as were a few rare collectible coins and gold used for industrial purposes. But for nearly everyone else, there was no escape clause. Every gold coin, every bar, every certificate had to be turned in. And the price you'd get? $20.67 per ounce. Fixed by the government. No haggling, no market rate. For families like Mary Thompson's, who had gold coins handed down from the California gold rush, the order felt like betrayal. Those coins weren't just money, they were family history. Now, holding on to them meant risking prison. The fear spread fast. Radio announcers read the order during evening news hours. Newspapers printed it in bold headlines. Dinner tables across America were filled with whispered questions. Do we have to give them all of it? What if we hide some? What if someone turns us in? Within hours, millions of law-abiding citizens had been recast as potential felons, not for anything they'd done, but simply for owning the same property they'd legally possessed the day before. The stroke of a pen had changed the rules of the game. And now, the Roosevelt administration faced its next challenge. How do you get an entire nation to actually comply? How do you make millions of people hand over their most valuable possession willingly? Roosevelt's administration knew the executive order alone wasn't enough. Sure, the threat of 10 years in prison was intimidating, but fear has a short half-life. They needed something stronger, something that would make Americans want to give up their gold. So they launched one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in U.S. history. It began the very next day. Newspapers, once neutral observers, suddenly ran headlines portraying gold holders as selfish hoarders strangling the nation's recovery. Editorials didn't mince words. Every coin you hide is another man out of work. Holding gold is un-American. It was guilt wrapped in patriotism. Radio stations carried the message into millions of living rooms. During primetime broadcasts, soothing-voiced announcers explained how turning in your gold would help your neighbors, create jobs, and get America back on its feet. They told emotional stories about families suffering in unemployment lines, stories that always ended with the same implied villain, the person still holding gold. It worked. People began to look differently at their neighbors. A man who hesitated to surrender his coins wasn't just protecting his savings. He was, in the eyes of the community, standing in the way of the country's recovery. Banks joined in. Posters appeared in lobbies and on street corners. Surrender gold, save America. Your country needs your coins. Some even framed the act like buying war bonds, a noble sacrifice for the greater good. Clerks behind the counter were told to smile, to congratulate customers for doing their patriotic duty as they handed over generations of family wealth. Treasury Secretary William Woodin went on the radio to explain in carefully chosen words why gold in private hands was a threat to national recovery. The logic was simple. The government couldn't fix the economy if Americans kept clinging to their gold. The unspoken part? They also couldn't profit from it unless it was in their vaults. And slowly, the mood shifted. What could have been seen as an outrageous theft of private property was reframed as a noble act of citizenship. Friends who had initially sworn to resist now queued up at the bank, convinced they were saving the country. The few who still held out found themselves isolated, even whispered about. By the time the May 1st deadline loomed, the propaganda had worked better than force ever could. What happened next would stun the nation, not because of how much gold was surrendered, but because of what the government did with it. April 30th, 1933. Across America, banks were swamped, but not with panicked withdrawals. This time, the lines formed for something stranger and far more heartbreaking. Mothers clutched small velvet pouches of gold coins that had been wedding gifts decades earlier. Elderly men carried wooden boxes of bullion they had protected through 2 world wars. Families arrived with manila envelopes containing gold certificates, paper proof of wealth that had once been as good as the metal itself. They weren't depositing this money, they were giving it away. By law. In just 30 days, Americans surrendered 2,976,000 ounces of gold, worth $118 million at the fixed government price of $20.67 an ounce. Adjusted for today, that's around $10 billion stripped from private hands in a single month. The human stories behind those numbers were devastating. Coins from the California gold rush, passed down like sacred relics, now sat in bank drawers waiting for armored trucks. Generations of careful saving vanished in moments. And the government clerks who processed the forms? They were trained to smile and congratulate you, because this was patriotism, after all. But the real shock came less than a year later. On January 30th, 1934, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act, instantly raising the price of gold to $35 an ounce. Overnight, the government's new hoard jumped in value by billions. The math was staggering. A $2.8 billion profit, nearly half of the entire federal budget that year, made from the gold Americans had just surrendered at gunpoint of the law. The same families who had walked into the bank thinking they were saving the country were now holding paper money that had already lost value, while the government pocketed the windfall. It was the most profitable confiscation in American history. And yet, not everyone complied. A small number of defiant Americans refused to hand over their gold, and one man would take his fight all the way to the Supreme Court. What happened to him would prove just how unstoppable the government had become. Not everyone bowed their head and obeyed. In San Francisco, a wealthy businessman named Frederick Barber Campbell stared at over $200,000 worth of gold bars in his possession, a fortune in 1933, enough to buy entire city blocks. And he made a decision almost no one dared to make. He would not surrender. Campbell believed the Constitution was his shield. The Fifth Amendment promised that private property couldn't be seized without just compensation. And here was the president, with the stroke of a pen, telling him it was now a federal crime to keep what had been perfectly legal yesterday. He hired lawyers. He prepared for a fight. And he wasn't just challenging a policy. He was challenging the very idea that a president could rewrite the rules of ownership overnight. The case climbed the legal ladder, eventually merging into a broader battle, Norman versus Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, 1935. This was no longer just about Campbell's gold. It was about the fate of every ounce confiscated under Executive Order 6102. If Campbell won, the government could be forced to return billions in gold, a financial earthquake. But the ruling that came down from the Supreme Court was devastating. The justices declared that Congress had the constitutional power to regulate the value of money, even if that meant voiding private gold ownership and ripping gold clauses out of contracts. In one sentence, they had made the confiscation not just legal, but untouchable. For Campbell, the toll was more than financial. During one hearing, he collapsed from a heart attack. His personal rebellion had cost him his health, his fortune, and ultimately his fight. And for the rest of America, the message was loud and clear. Resistance was useless. With the gold now firmly in government hands, another question emerged. Where could they possibly store such a colossal treasure? The answer would become a fortress of legend, Fort Knox. Construction began in 1936, guarded by armed patrols, surrounded by minefields, encased in 3-foot-thick reinforced concrete walls, and sealed by a 20-ton door with a combination split between multiple people, so no single person could open it. By 1941, it held more than 650 million ounces of gold, more than half the nation's reserves, most of it once owned by ordinary Americans. It was the ultimate irony, a vault built to protect gold from the very people who once owned it. But the final twist in this story? The public hasn't seen what's inside for nearly 50 years. The last official audit of America's gold reserves happened in 1974. Nearly half a century has passed since anyone outside the government has seen what's really inside Fort Knox. For all we know, the vault could still be stacked to the ceiling with gleaming bars. Or it could be an empty concrete shell, its treasure long gone. And yet, almost no one asks the question. The silence is deafening. In 1933, the government convinced millions of Americans to surrender their gold for the good of the nation. It was framed as a patriotic sacrifice. But less than a year later, they revalued that same gold, instantly turning it into a $2.8 billion windfall for Washington. Was it a desperate but necessary emergency measure to save the economy? Or the most profitable government heist in American history? That's the uncomfortable part. Both can be true. And if a stroke of the president's pen could erase property rights overnight back then, what else could they take in the name of emergency tomorrow? History doesn't just repeat itself. Sometimes it waits. If you found this video insightful, like, share, and hit the subscribe button to join our community for more deep dives into untold financial history stories and groundbreaking revelations shaping the global economy. Click the next video for another intriguing narrative. Thanks for watching.